Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. I'm here today with author R. David Fulcher, and he writes horror, science fiction, fantasy, and poetry. He also wrote Trains to Nowhere, which is a historical drama set in World War II. He's written Blood Spiders and Dark Moon, a collection of fantasy and science fiction short stories, Asteroid 6 and Other Tales of Cosmic Horror, and The Pumpkin King and Other Tales of Terror. His work has also appeared in many small press publications, including Lovecraft's Mystery Magazine, Black Satellite, The Martian Wave, Weird Times, and many others. He was in the anthologies Dimensions and Silken Ropes, and he also created and published the literary magazine Samsara, which has showcased writers and poets for over a decade. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I appreciate it.
But before we start into talking about your work and how it relates to folklore, can you tell us how you've been folkloring lately?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make sure from the expert yourself if this is folkloring or sort of just going into some sort of meditative magic realism. But we got about 5 to 6 inches of snow here the other evening in the DC area. And I went out about 11 and took some photos. It was a full moon.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself in a very sort of meditative state, letting myself, imagine if as if the trees could speak, what that would sound like. It was a very quiet time. Nobody else was out about due to the weather. Looking up the full moon, what sort of creatures would be spiraling around it, things like that. So, just kind of let my imagination go. I don't know if that's folkloring or magic realism or just a bad trip, but it's kind of what happened. So
I definitely would count that as folkloring because really you were connecting to nature. And I think that there's a lot of power in connecting to that energy. I think that one of the things that we can do to sort of calm ourselves and our bodies and our spirits down is to connect with nature because the vibrational frequency in nature is slightly lower than like in human beings. And we feel better when our vibration comes down within, the healthy range of what our vibrational energy is. So yeah, that actually helps calm our systems down. So 100% counts.
I'm glad it's valid. I'd say less emotional and more sort of related to my work. I have recently published a blog post about the intersection of AI and art, and then I kind of followed that up with on my own blog site with a fiction story inspired by the same notion of art being coming to life and animated by an AI. So you sort of got me into this concept of a digital folklore world. So I think of late I've been exploring that a little bit more than traditional folklore.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, as for me, I did go to a full moon ritual, though as I was coming and going from that, I was not communing with nature that night because it was bitterly cold here and I was just trying to get to my car. But that was definitely an interesting, and it took some time, but I do love going to a ritual. So that's really the big thing. I feel a little bit like it's folkloring. I'm not sure that it is. Maybe you can give me your opinion that so there's a water main that broke near me about 36 hours ago. And we have been on uh, boiling, like we have to boil all the water. And so I'm like boiling my water for everything. And I'm like, man, I could be homesteading having to boil all this water before I use it. So not sure that that quite
It,
qualifies.
it depends. I mean, it definitely takes us back to an earlier time, right? When we didn't have convenience and our daily rituals were very different. So.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously I have to do it, or I wouldn't be doing it. But I think that maybe I can elevate it to folkloring by considering sort of the symbolism and how I can sort of tie back to my ancestors that would have had to do that. So symbolism counts for me.
All right, we're going to call that valid. So,
Okay. All right, so let's get into it. Can you talk a little bit
yeah,
about yourself and your path that got you to where you are today?
yeah, I was sort of I'd say a normal child, and I think what sort of put me on my path to becoming a writer was in high school. I think the English teacher introduced Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, I had heard of him, but not really read his works, and she actually required us to do so, and that really connected with me. And I think that kind of started me on this whole path, and that started me submitting to the school literary journal. And then when I graduated, I had a little more confidence as a writer, getting into some stories accepted in the small press, and getting some accolades from people that were outside of my immediate circle for my work. And so that just continued to sort of inspire me and build my confidence until I started actually self-publishing, and with much gratitude, I'm finally picked up by Gravelight Press, which is an offshoot of Devil's Party Press,
Okay.
for as an actual publishing contract. So my two most recent books are published by a publisher as opposed to what some would call a vanity press or a self-publishing campaign.
Hmm. Great. It's interesting to me that Edgar Allan Poe was one of your first loves. And I was noticing that you write for a lot of, you write a lot of shorter pieces for the, collections of short stories and all of the different, publications that you write for. And so you kind of stayed in, because like in that sort of short format, except for your novel, of course.
And even that is sort of novella length, so it didn't get to, unfortunately, to several hundred pages. I think that's under 90. So I mean, and that took, even the chapters are very episodic, so I feel like I could sort of take some of them out of context and sort of prop them up as related short stories. So
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's my natural format. I'd love to produce a novel one day, but it just seems to be my bent to be craft, these short stories for whatever reason. And I do start off The Pumpkin King, which is one of the Gravelight Press books, with Eulogy to E.A. Poe as the first, where the book opens with a poem, but then the rest of it is prose. So I want to give, I try to give, credit where credit's due by kicking
Sure.
off that way.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about some of your various books and the stories in them. Can you walk us through?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to focus mostly on my last two because they are from a publisher, which I think, and they've had Midwest reviews, and it gives them a little more clout, I think, than some of my early self-published work. So The Pumpkin King and Other Tales of Terror is kind of my greatest hits of my horror work.
Okay.
You'll find a lot of Halloween-inspired stories there. I'd say it's more of my traditional horror book. So you've got werewolves, ghosts, vampires, Halloween spirits. Again, a Halloween tree. Some of those things all appear in the Pumpkin King, and then my most recent book, Asteroid 6 and Other Tales of Cosmic Horror, continue on more of a darker horror bent, but these stories are cosmic horror and taking place more in outer space.
Okay. Yeah, I read some of the stories, and the Pumpkin King was definitely very creepy. That gave
And
me chills.
that's like the best compliment you can give, right? So it sounds crazy, but I love to hear that. So thank you.
So do you research the folklore behind it, or do you just draw from kind of your own knowledge?
I think I do a lot of reading, and I think, and I did a fair amount of studies of, and actually took, 100 level or 200 level mythology classes in college, which is as electives. So I think the things that resonated with me, I carry with me. Also, I watch a lot of movies. So I think it's Halloween 3 that harkens back to the actual, Druid origins of Halloween. So I draw on a lot of that. So I think things that just stick with me, they kind of permutate and percolate and they become out as your appearances in your work.
Okay, great. So let's talk about some of the folklore in the different stories. You mentioned werewolves and ghosts. Definitely, we talked a little about the Halloween spirits. So let's talk about some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a story called The Land Spider, which is set in the American Southwest. And I'll talk later about what inspires me to write, but it was inspired by a visit to New Mexico while my brother was attending the University of New Mexico, or UNM. And there's a tribe there, I think called the Tiwas, that are indigenous to that part of the country, that believed in that the canyons and that magnificent landscape out there was created by a huge spider. And it was all the mesas and canyons and everything were spun out of a gigantic spider.
Sure.
So that prompted me to write a story about a gigantic spider that was creating these huge sinkholes under a New Mexican town and sort of swallowing the buildings, one after the other. And
Oh, cool.
the Indians started to basically gather by the sinkholes and worship it, where all the everyone else was terrified and fleeing, right? But it's kind of they kind of saw it for what it was, and they accepted one of their myths as a possible reality, and nobody else really could. So that is one of the American Southwest myths I use. I have an online series called Vlad the Conqueror, which goes back. I read a lot about Vlad the Impaler, the historical Dracula, who they think was a historical inspiration for what became our Count Dracula,
Right.
because they called him Vlad Dracul, as part of his family's name. So, and they were, of course, the rulers in that part of Transylvania, and did battle the Turks, as presented in some of the more recent movies that, just like Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, shows Gary Oldman's at first, battling the Turks, right on the edge of the Carpathian Mountains, or right near Castle Dracula. So that's where I like the old vampire myths from Romania. And then there's people I think that have created, their own mythologies. So I borrow a lot of Lovecraft's
Okay.
sort of pantheon of gods, and I think and his book center around a sacred text called the Necronomicon, and all these art devices in his work, and it's got such popularity that I think it's an accepted mythology now for a lot of people that enjoy speculative fiction. Um,
Sure.
like I don't think anybody's shocked when they see somebody reading the Necronomicon, a character in a book, and they just assume now this is a thing. It's valid to draw upon Lovecraftian references at this point. So
I've actually got a cookbook called the Nom Nom Nom. And
oh,
yeah,
that is a cool intersection of
yeah,
literature.
and each of the recipes is based on some part of the writing.
Oh wow, okay, so you have like Cthulhu soup or something like that, or
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
it's great. It's
that's
hysterical.
very cool.
Yeah. So, that's interesting about the spider mythology. And of course, one of the more famous mythological spiders is Anansi. But that's like a trickster spider. And so all of those tales to me are, a lot of them are Anansi getting in trouble himself and creating his own problems for himself. But also creating problems for everyone around him. But yeah, I've not heard much other spider mythology that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there is, because spiders are everywhere. But yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's really it's more the spider as creator, right, as opposed to destroyer.
Right.
in the myth. So it's interesting. And American Indian lore is full of this stuff. Very rich with where earth meets sky and all of that. So,
Mhm.
very elemental forces that work in their belief system.
Now, do you ever like do retellings of classic stories, or is it all just sort of inspiration from characters or themes from folklore?
I don't do retellings, but I do reference characters for example, I have a story about young King Arthur, so I reference the characters in Arthurian legend. So there's Arthur as a child, there's Sir Kay, there's Merlin. So I do borrow from things that are sort of came before, and I think readers will identify with. I like to see these people pop up every now and then as, oh wow, Merlin made it a cameo in his story. So, but I don't straight up take a story and try to retell it in full length from its original format.
Now, was the King Arthur story horror as well?
No, I'd say it's actually, I would call it young adult fantasy. It could be read by, elementary school on up. There's um, nothing that would get it like a beyond a PG rating. So,
Okay.
very clean. It's called Arthur and the Pixies, and it's about, one of Arthur's first quests from Merlin is that these pixies have been caged and captured by this like cave ogre, and so Arthur's quest is to go and free them. And of course he does, and this I imply that this creates sort of a lifelong bond between him and the neighboring pixies in this forest, for that he will use that alliance later, in his later conflicts.
Is there a lot of crossover with King Arthur and like fairy stories? Because this is the second time, literally this week, that I heard about a crossover story with,
Wow.
yeah, it's very strange, and I didn't know that there was any. I've read a couple of King Arthur tales, and I watched the show Merlin, but I'm not super up on my King Arthur lore.
No, I don't know if it's ever referenced really, because I've read most of the nonfiction, like Le Mort the Author, I think, which is like a one of like these this academic works on King Arthur, and um, there's a lot of creatures and things, but I don't think fairies or pixies are ever referenced. I think what happens is, because you do see references to things like dragons, you say, well, okay, if the door's open a little bit, let's kick it open and
Right,
let everything else in, right? So
right.
I don't think it's I don't know of any trace back to the real legend, but I'd be fascinated to find out a text that actually suggested it from that time period.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be very interesting because I have not heard much of it, and just that it came up twice within a week is like what's
That is
happening
amazing.
with fairies?
So, wow, I wonder if I did it first or the other person, but we'll have to compare notes on it.
Yeah, maybe it's just the fairies trying to reach out to me, send me a message, but I have no idea what it is. So
There it is. Yeah, it could just be yeah, you're picking up on the frequency like you talked about. So,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Uh-huh.
So I want to hear a little bit more about, you said some werewolves pop up. I want to hear about those stories.
Yeah, the first one is in called A Night for Animals, and it's basically set in a campground. I like to do a lot of camping, and there's a couple arguing. The It's implied that the husband is ritually abusive to the wife, and gets to the point where she escapes into the woods and kind of starts trekking up the mountain. This is supposed to be in Skyline Drive, which is a big national forest out here in
Okay.
Virginia, and sees some lights because she's tired and it's cold and all that. But the last thing she's going to do is give him the satisfaction of going back to the campsite. So she goes towards this cabin that seems to be occupied, and there is a guy there that takes her in, gets her a blanket, gets her some herbal tea and things like that to calm her down. Knows that she's been through some sort of PTSD event, and there's a sort of romantic scene where he bites her, and then the next thing you know, she's also a werewolf, and the two of them sort of for lack of a better term, go back to the campsite and take care of business. So
As you do.
yeah, exactly. So that's one. I'm trying to think if I have multiple werewolf stories or if that's my real one. I think that might be it, but I do have a were-cat story.
Oh,
Um, is set in a bar in Germany based on a real bar I visited when I visited my brother who lives over there. And the top floor of the bar was like a normal German bar, but they did have a discotheque downstairs. And when you went down the discotheque, they had this crazy swirling light show projected against one of the walls, well, to go along with the music. So I kind of incorporate that into the club being not just a club of, new wavers, but a club of werecats.
oh.
And so this foolish American named David, so pattern after myself, clomps down the stairs and thinks it's all just a great time until, of course, he becomes one of the pack himself. So, and that one's called that is in Asteroid 6, even though it takes place on Earth. Some of the horror stories that are more traditional did creep into the second volume,
Okay.
just due to a lack of space, getting all the stories collected into the first. So, but it's called Club Mitternacht, and of course it's Club Midnight in English, and uses some German. I put some German in the story because I think gives a nice local touch to the story, and it's something I studied up to college, so I'm semi-fluent. So I try to. I do. It's not the first story that I incorporate German language into the tale. So.
Well, now that we've moved on to the space book, let's go to space and talk
Okay,
about some
let's
of
do it.
those stories. Uh,
Okay.
because I do, I mean, and it's funny because I've said a lot, and my listeners will be like, yes, Tracy, you've said this before, but that there are a lot of parallels between fairy stories and like alien abductions. So I don't know, those fairies are reaching out to me. They keep making me think about them.
Yeah. No, I mean it's kind of yeah, where do fairies and aliens begin, sort of. You could even say like in I don't know if you saw oh gosh, I forget the name of the underwater movie, but um basically an oil rig crew is trapped under the water and then these things that look like angels basically save them and they're clearly aliens but composed purely of light, so
Okay.
what do you call that? Is it an angel? Is it an alien? Is it a fairy? I think it's kind of in that same space. So
Right.
I agree with you. So yeah, some of the outer space stories that I like, I have a story called Madame Zeiss Perfume, where a guy touches down on a planet and is drawn into some ruins and suddenly finds goes through like a vacuum seal where he can take off his helmet and breathe normal oxygen.
Hmm.
And the last thing he expected is before him a sort of medieval feast is going on, and everybody's lavishly dressed and drinking wine and carrying on as if they were on Earth, right, back
Uh-huh.
in medieval times. And he gets caught up in the spell, and every now and then things seem to be a little off. Some of the guests don't seem so animated sometimes, and then when he has these sort of feels a little more sober. During the feast, he gets Madame Zeist, who's the host, comes over and gives him a spray of her perfume, and he's back under the spell again. And it becomes that he realizes at one point, where he goes too long without the perfume, that everybody at the table is a corpse,
Oh,
and they're wearing different, spacesuits of different nations and things like that. So
oh,
they've all
wow.
stumbled upon Madame Zeiss's lair, and she's there, but she's sort of like a lizard-like alien. Of course, before he can start to scream too much, she sprays him with perfume, and that's how it ends. So
Oh, wow. That's
the
wild.
screaming stops, and he's in bliss again. So he's just blissfully unaware of it. He's
Sure.
eternal, with Madame Zeiss on that planet. So I like that one. That actually happens to be my wife's favorite story, so I like to talk about that when I do try to force my work on her, but it's not her favorite reading. She'd probably rather read romance, but when she's kind enough to check them out, there's a few that resonate with her, and she likes that one. And then the title story of the book itself, which is Asteroid 6, is about a mining freighter going through an asteroid belt.
Oh, yes. I read this one.
Okay, yeah, and it crash lands, and then there's this pyramid, which is, kind of Egyptian because it's full of hieroglyphs, but it's totally night black, so it's kind of a period out of, Yog Sothoth or one of, Lovecraftian's tales. It's kind of a blend of these things, and then the traveler, the guy who survives the crash landing, goes in to the heart of the pyramid because he's being called by these voices, and there's all these aliens, kind of stacked up in these vertical coffins, I guess you'd call them, or chambers,
Mhm.
and begging to be released. And he comes very close to doing so, but
Wait,
then he
wait,
sees.
stop. You got to stop right there because I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
want you to give away the end of this one. This one is,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was a good surprise.
I'm glad. I'm
So,
glad.
so
Thank
yeah,
you.
don't spoil that one for people because that was I was shocked when the whole ending came about.
That's fantastic because I mean, one of the things that you fear as a short story writer is that you write become formulaic, and that
Mhm.
somebody immediately that has read some of your stuff says, "Oh, here he goes again. I know how this one's going to end." So if I can avoid that at all costs, that's fantastic. I
Yeah.
do worry about that as a writer, of
I
course.
was definitely surprised with the Pumpkin King as well at the end. Like, and it was at the very, very end. There was like the just a shocking kind of, imagery at the end in my mind. So, but let's
Yeah,
talk about the character of the Pumpkin King. We didn't really talk about
okay.
that because that is like it's looking at Halloween, but it's really a completely unique character. And I don't think we'll give away any spoilers if we just focus on that.
Yeah, I think he's kind of the enforcer, right, to me, of Halloween and its rules, right? So it kind of goes back to Scream or one of these movies where they say everything's, every sequel's got rules, right? Well, I think every horror story's got rules. Well, I think Halloween has rules, right? And the, the guy makes, we won't let it away, but the guy makes a mistake on Halloween and doesn't sort of pay homage, to the holiday and its king, and the Pumpkin King who enforces these rules shows up at his door and is very upset about that. So, so to me, he's kind of the Halloween cop, right? He's in charge of making sure everybody follows along, and when they don't, he brings them to bear. So,
Yeah, it's
that's
it's funny.
how I look at him. Yeah,
I love Halloween. I love decorating for it. And so my collection of decor for Halloween is almost as much as my Christmas stuff.
right. Yep.
And so I always, do it up, right? And it's great. I have a little Halloween village, just like a little Christmas town. But one year, I live in a single family home and just a suburban neighborhood. And
Mhm.
so one year I had to go on Halloween to Denver for a day trip. And I left in the morning and I came home at night. So, and there was like a meeting in the afternoon. And so I didn't get home until I was 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And I had put out a bowl of candy, like, please just take one. And of course, it was all gone and the bowl was gone and everything. And they egged my house and broke. I had a little like wooden yard sign, a little super cute little ghost, and they broke that. And
Hmm.
so I feel like, yeah, like I wasn't there for the kids, so the spirit of Halloween punished me.
Wow. Okay, so you had your own encounter with the Pumpkin King. That's fascinating.
Exactly, exactly. But he was
Yeah,
using
yeah,
his minions.
yeah. I bet you won't make the mistake again, right? So,
Never have
yeah.
made that same mistake again.
No, yeah.
So,
It ends well, so that's good.
so you said a little bit earlier you were going to talk about where you get your inspiration for the stories. I know you talked about it a little, obviously with the spider worship. Was there anything else you wanted to say on that topic?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, and that ties into place. So I'd say my number one inspiration are places that resonate with me. So
Okay.
the land spider, I was very New Mexico's sort of landscape really resonated with me. So that fermented for a long time, but it eventually came out in the form of that story, The Land Spider. One of my self-published books is called The Lighthouse at Montauk Point, and my wife and I were married in Long Island, and then during our honeymoon, we took a trip all the way out to Montauk, the very edge of Long Island, and visited the Montauk Point Lighthouse. Again, super, which they've made into a museum, not so much a functioning lighthouse. Super interesting to me place because it had the original lens with all the refractored pieces of glass that made that great light that you see,
Mhm.
fly out across the ocean. So, and it's on the cover of my book, The Lighthouse at Montauk Point. So, or there's a lighthouse over cliffs in the ocean, whether it's
Aren't those called Fresnel lenses?
they may be. I didn't get to study it, or I didn't remember it if I read the plaque. I'm sure it's on the plaque, because it was a
Yeah, I
museum.
was I was a theater kid, and there are certain lighting instruments that use Fresnel lenses, and I was shocked to discover that that's what they use in some lighthouses.
Yeah, I was shocked to see that it was all these individual pieces and not a solid pane, or concave bowl that made
Yeah.
that made up the lens. So yeah, so that's another place inspired. And then the Pumpkin Kings, I don't know if it's a second or third story, has Castle Marienburg, which is a castle that you can Google that I visited while visiting my brother in Europe, and made a huge impression on me. It's more unlike Neuschwanstein, which is like a decorative castle, I'd almost say. Marienburg was a fortified castle, so it was actually meant to keep opposing armies out. So it's a
Mhm.
little bit more rugged, but right in the middle is a cathedral, or a little church, which so it's very kind of a mix of like military purpose and then beauty. So and it's set in the forest too, which is adds to it. So made a huge impression on me. And I have a story called Castle Marienburg about soldiers that get trapped in that castle. So and forces from the outside breaking it. So
Yeah, I think that it's, people talk a lot about land spirits, and I think that some of that is the land feels different when you go to different places, right? If there's
yeah,
more history, you feel the weight of that. And if there's, places that are have weather that can kill you, right? Your community feels a little different. I think that one of the ways that people define that for themselves is land spirits or the ancestors are settled into the area that you're in. And I think that places do have a different feel depending on, where you are, and even different times of the year. Places feel different. And, it's like people talk about, the sleeping land spirits because it's, snowy and cold and nothing is growing. And that's why it feels different because they're asleep, or so I can totally see that places would be very inspirational because it just leads you, down a path, particularly places with like cool history, right? Because then you've got a story in your mind to tie to that place and the feeling you had there. And I was just talking to another author the other day, and we were talking about this idea that a lot of stories are teaching people things, right? We learn lessons, and there is an effect. It's called the sleeper effect, that you learn the lesson from the story, but then ultimately you start to forget that it was from a story, and you do forget. And so the lesson is just embedded in you, and you've, forgotten it, that it ever came from a story. So I think that that feeling tying to a story in a place is, that would be very inspirational, especially, like I said, places with history.
yeah, and in a way, for people that have been exposed to the less mythology, we're basically retelling myth, right? And
Sure.
legend that we've learned. And we could be the first time as a writer of fiction, which is sounds crazy because it's supposed to be false, by nature, um, is you know, is their first opportunity to learn a concept that may lead them to study more about it. So
Right.
it's great to have an opportunity to hear somebody say, "Wow, I never even knew about the Tiwas Indians in the American Southwest," or wow, I loved your story and I looked up that castle and it's really there on Google Maps and it's a real place. Yeah, of course it is. So
Yep.
yeah, so anytime you can teach, as well as entertain, that's awesome. So
Yeah, and I think, you like when you think about the places that appealed to you, that did drive those weren't cities, it was Native American stories, and so they were obviously much closer to the land. And then in Europe, which is steeped in a long tradition and has lots of, lore. And when you go to a place where, people were fighting and dying or being imprisoned, because some of the castles I've been to have had some really creepy dungeon prison stuff, and
Yes.
that's terrible. And then, a lighthouse, which is saving people from crashing, their ships on the rocks. And so it's like all those places were very connected to the land.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's probably what I'm feeling because I do love the outdoors. So
Hmm. Okay, well, where can people find your work?
yeah, so lots of places. I guess first the hub, I guess, would to start with would be I have my own domain, so I'm rdavidfulcher.com. That's where you find my website. My blog is there, but it also has bibliography, so it has links to books. It also has my bio and any news, about any new books or things like that, or if I got published a story in Spillwords, or I got a story published in some other web journal or poem, that you would find that out there. But then going from there, it's if you're interested in my books, it'd be gravelightpress.com.
Okay.
Or you can start at the parent site, which is devilspartypress.com, and then go to their menu that says imprints and go to Gravelight Press. Then all the usual places, right? My work is on Amazon. It's on barnesandnoble.com. It's on Audible, so I even have Audible audio versions of my books. And then I am glad that Google isn't so bad when you simply put my name into it. It's you get some false hits, but I my on the first page at least, some of my
Hmm.
real stuff comes up as opposed to the latest sale at IKEA or something. So I think I'm pretty wired in terms of finding me online at least.
Great.
Um, I don't know that your local library would have my work, and I would be pleasantly surprised if that's the case, but online I should be very easy to find.
And just remember, people, if your local library does not have the work, you can always request that they order it. So, and
That would be huge, but
yeah, for me, my library, I can actually just do it online and request an order.
okay.
And they've always said yes up until one book that was more of an academic book and it was pricier. And they
Mhm.
said, we can't buy books over whatever. It was like a $50 book. So
Oh,
I
wow.
wasn't
Okay.
super surprised by that, which is why I didn't want to buy it. But
Yeah,
so,
that being said, yeah, I have some low cost options. The audiobooks, tend to be cheaper, and the Kindles, tend to be cheaper than the paperbacks.
yeah.
I prefer paperbacks, so I'd love people to buy them, but I understand that everybody's got limited resources. So
Yeah, I prefer paperback certainly to anything electronic, but I prefer paperback even to hardcover. There's something about a paperback that
yeah,
feels like your friend more.
yeah, yeah. It's like it bends and flexes, and when you have that really worn look, it's great.
Yep.
You're free to kind of take the hardbound book to the beach or whatever, but you think
Yep.
nothing of it for a paperback. So I agree with you.
Yep. Okay, do you have any final thoughts for listeners?
Um, yeah, I think to kind of like tie it all back to your folkloring podcast, and thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored, and I appreciate all the time. And you've had we've had great conversations.
Mhm.
So it has not been a chore at all. So,
Good, good, good.
um, but I would say that there's that very people tied very much to the material routine of the world, and there's a sadness that they only get to sort of connect with the more myth and legend and folklore, or feel that freedom on something on a holiday like Halloween, or
Hmm.
we've got St. Patrick's Day coming up, and somebody that thinks themselves very practical and doesn't believe in any of that mushy mush, right? Thinks nothing of believing in leprechauns and a pot of gold on March 17th, right? So
Right.
I think the all of us that are more attuned to these frequencies, and um, more of a creative bent, perhaps, poets, painters, songwriters, whatever. It's really a gift that I think we live in that space all the time. And I think don't take that for granted, because some people only intersect with that space and very few times in their lives. So that would be my message. If you're in that space all the time, be grateful because it is a magical space.
Yes, absolutely. And if you're not in that space, you can get there by reading the books that we talked about today.
Yes, and following the Folkloring Podcast. Absolutely correct.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here
Well,
today. And thanks to everybody for listening.
thanks everyone. Thank you so much, Tracy.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.